Moving on to part two of this three-part series on stress injuries and resilience, the stress continuum. I'm going to go over it in a little bit more detail. I will provide links at the very least on the South Metro Peer Support website, which is southmetropeersupport.org, of some of these slides, because I don't want to be reading slides to you, and I'm sure you don't want to sit there and listen to me read slides. But I want you to have a resource if you want to refresh your memory as you're working with it. So you've seen the basic stress continuum before. This is the same basic graphic that is on the 3x5 cards I keep mentioning. And what it is describing is the consequences, so the signs and symptoms of stress injuries. And what's unique about stress injuries is that some of the signs and symptoms are actually behavioral. The ways in which we act indicate that we may have a stress injury. In the past, we would maybe view someone that is, well, we might describe them as salty or burned out, but those behaviors of being possibly more cynical or self-isolating, more irritable, that, like I said in the past, might have been like, that's just the grumpy old Ben, the 23-year-old guy. That may very well be the case. Some people may be grumpy at times, but it's helpful to also consider whether or not that's actually the impact of this cycle of injury, which is that chronic exposure to stress and acute stress without rest and recovery. So without giving people too big a break for their ill behavior, it is helpful if we can see our own behavior with more nuance and context, and the same goes for other people. All right, here we go. So it is a continuum, like I had mentioned before. We move back and forth in our behaviors and how we feel, and then obviously how we would describe how we feel. It's simply 4 colors. You can invent as many colors that are in between those as you want, or your own colors. Sometimes we try and shoot for fluorescent green, is peg this scale all the way over on the left. But I imagine that you're reading these slides as we go along. You may have exhibited some of these behaviors or experienced some of these symptoms yourself, or witnessed them in your coworkers. A couple of things to point out is, as one moves more towards the red, so they're experiencing more of those signs and symptoms, exhibiting more of those behaviors, it gets more difficult for that individual and actually an organization to move themselves back towards the green. So what that means is it places a premium and a need on planning for when us as individuals or our company or our organization is going to be in these times, planning actions that will take to reduce the stress injury cycle and move ourselves back towards a place where we are more rested, more rejuvenated, closer to our full capacity. A unique thing about reading the green section of it, and there'll be an expanded green section, is it's not only descriptive of how people are, but it also can be used aspirationally. So as far as what are activities that you could pursue to feel replenished. You'll notice healthy sleeping is in there. Poor sleep, lack of adequate sleep is very prevalent at South Metro, as it is in all emergency services, particularly regarding to shift work. And if we pursue that, so to the best of our abilities in the environments that we can control better, meaning our home environment versus our work environment, for the most part, maximize that opportunity for rest and recovery and sleep, then that will be moving us towards the green. And then just as that can be a goal, we also want behaviors that we start to exhibit in the orange and red. Those should be triggers that we need to be more purposeful about our actions. So we will be covering this more in depth in the resilience section of how to actually use it as a tool. What does green look like? Well, here are the descriptors of someone that is highly functioning, that is getting enough rest and recovery in their life, that has high levels for them of engagement and authentic relationships, meaning a sense of accomplishment for themselves and positive emotions in their life, positive things going on. So you can see that's good mental health. We're all going to have fluctuations in our mood, but they should be relatively minor or able to be regulated. Generally, we're feeling calm and confident, not all the time and not in all circumstances, particularly depending if we are in a new role, if we're a recruit working our first year on the department. But these are descriptors of our behavior, of our mental state, and our physical state that we would be in the green. I want to point out there on the right-hand side, third from the bottom, no or very limited alcohol use. I'm not a teetotaler myself. I do drink. I will tell you that I drink vastly less than I have in the past. Many people of my age group, which is 50s, drink less than they have because the downsides of it, the negative impacts of drinking start to add up over time. And as we age, we don't have the resources to recover as well. So for me, the big thing is it affects my sleep, which then affects my mood, which affects all the other parts of my life. So I feel like I just feel better, frankly, not drinking as much. I'm not saying you should cut it all out. What I do strongly recommend is that you be mindful of how much you're drinking and when you're drinking, and how much of it might be just a pattern or a habit. So we generally aren't, and it's not reasonable to expect that we could be in the green all the time, but when we have stressors that pull us out, they're generally self-limiting. We can handle those. Maybe it's traffic, maybe we just, we need a little bit more rest. We've come off a 48-hour shift and we're tired. We need to go outside and recharge. But we start to exhibit some fraying around the edges, so to speak. They're less significant. But when we notice these things in ourselves, we want to be, once again, taking action to mitigate them. There's a couple of kind of pernicious trends that happen when we get more and more stress injured, and they are self-isolation and moving away from our communities of support. It's kind of the phenomenon on Facebook or social media. People are only sharing the good things in their life. That's a common desire, particularly in this profession. We are somewhat averse to very dramatic people, I think. So the more dramatic people are, we kind of push away. And so we don't want to exhibit that in ourselves. But there's this misunderstanding that we have of just expressing the fact that you're not doing well, or you're maybe a little worried or anxious or upset in some regard, is not dramatic. It's just speaking the truth about the natural human reaction that we have. And of course, that is what this entire continuum is describing, the natural human response to that chronic and acute stress. So as we move into the orange, it's just really described as more persistent or pervasive. It's harder to get out of. Maybe our irritation has become anger, and we might be feeling like we're more negative. We have a hard time not thinking about negative things. These are recurrent intrusive thoughts that might pop into our head. Our energy is starting to decrease. The important part about, or one of the important parts about looking at this continuum and paying attention to it, is often there are little changes that go on throughout our careers and over the years that end up in the orange or the green. So this is how weight gain happens, right? We don't take our week trip to an all-inclusive and put on 40 pounds. We gradually gain that weight over time. And these behaviors, which are not productive for us, can build up as small habits, and then worse habits. And then over time, we end up in a situation where it's not readily apparent how we got there. So this is what the red looks like. It's a exacerbation, a magnification of the symptoms of yellow and orange. When we're in the red, what do we do? Three things I'd like to underscore is one, we need help to get ourselves out of the red. At the very least, that's peer support, somebody that knows what you're going through, but really more likely this is professional help. That might be only a counselor, and also frequently that could mean someone that is going to prescribe some medication. It's a common occurrence. I can think of a number of incidents where somebody's sleep has become so disrupted. Now they're trying to survive and get by on 2 to 3 hours of sleep for a protracted period of time. We simply cannot function like that as human beings. There's all kinds of bad effects from that. But we've gotten these people sometimes offline, sometimes remained online, but medicated to the point where they can now get some sleep. And this will then give them the resources and the ability to get themselves back out of the red to start mitigating some of the stress. So point number one, this is where you need help. It's important to point that out beforehand, because when we're in this state, it's probably hardest to ask for help. Point number two is that you still may be performing your job adequately at work in the red. That happens. I can think of a few people that have still been doing more or less okay at work, but in the red. What's important to note about that is that means that because you ask for help, and maybe use that coded language of I am in the red, or state that you're having panic attacks, or maybe you're struggling with controlling your alcohol, that doesn't mean that you're going to be pulled off of line. That means that you made a courageous decision to be an adult, to exhibit bravery through being vulnerable and asking for help. So, and then finally, many of the people, myself included, I would say, that end up in the disciplinary process at work are folks that are in the red. Basically, no one that's actually in the green and hanging out that has all of those attributes and resources of someone that's in that state is having repeated problems at work. Very frequently, when we are more stressed out because we have fewer resources, because we're not sleeping, because we're feeling anxious or angry, and we're simply not thinking as clearly, this is the profile of someone that's involved in the disciplinary process at our fire department. As you think about yourself on the continuum, and then what moves you one way or the other, this is a helpful illustration of thinking about the things that maybe charge you up or charge your battery, so to speak, and the things that drain your battery. The way in which you'd use it in relationship to the continuum for yourself would be to be purposeful about writing down, thinking about these things that charge you up or drain you. And so these are just some examples, but in general, there are things that people need to feel more rested and rejuvenated and have time, or that drain them. Space is this amount of basically time or distance in your life so that you can integrate things, connection with other people authentically. Of course, sleep is there. We evolved to move, so movement is really important for us. But when you're thinking about yourself, you want to be specific about your goals or your intentions, about the ways in which you move. That movement, I should say, might help you out. Play is just doing things for fun. Gratitude, trying to maximize that in your life is very helpful for people. Innovation can be in something along the lines of writing music, or it could be coming up in a new process or doing some woodworking. Mission satisfaction is in there because it's helpful when we can explore the things that we find really satisfying and then try and pursue more of them. Or across the side on that red part is find things that we find dissatisfying and look for maybe other perspectives that we can take with those situations, so that we might find more satisfaction of them and or find other things to do. And once again, on that right-hand side, just being careful to write down and record the things that drain you so that you can mitigate them and decrease the exposure you have to them. So simply put, don't do those things as much, or if they're in your life a lot and they can't be avoided, just realize that they are a drain on you and that you need to be purposeful about getting more rest and recovery. Two concepts about brain modes and biases. These are included because they inform how we interact with the world in the particular way that we do as emergency responders. And then when we get into trying to change some traits in the resilience part of this class, it's going to be readily apparent that these brain modes exist. So when we have more knowledge beforehand, we can understand what's going on and their impact on us. So let's start on the right side here. The negativity bias is something that's built into all of us. It doesn't mean that you're particularly pessimistic or that you're a negative person. It's an adaptive trait that humans have gained in the last couple 100,000 years that we've been hunter-gatherers and in this form because it's a survival practice. So the evolutionary environment from which we came was much different in as much as it had many, many more external threats to our safety versus internal threats. Today's environment, by contrast, is one where it's the safest that we've ever been to be a human on the earth, but we have a lot of things that we might feel psychologically threatening. That might be our mortgage statement, a home loan, our job or promotional test, the political cycle, and the news. So those are all perceived as threats, but they're internal and they're not external. The rub is this, is that hunter-gatherers had to be very wary of external threats, other tribes and predators in order to survive. So the people, our ancestors that were the most wary and alerted most quickly to negative events survived. And so this bias is built up in us. Consequently, because there was such a high cost of missing threats back then that benefited us when we didn't miss them, our brains evolved to be constantly scanning for threats and they're predisposed not to miss them. And then we give more weight So our ancestors came from that different evolutionary environment where they high cost of missing threats. So their brains have evolved to always be scanning the environment for those threats, and it's predisposed not to miss them. And then when we understand or think about our own learning, we weight negative events more heavily than we do neutral and positive events. So if you think about how a parent, maybe when you're a child, could tell you, don't touch that stove because it's hot, you heard what it was, but you really didn't learn it until you had that painful experience. And that was very much imprinted on your brain, whereas more positive things don't imprint as strongly. What's particular about emergency responders is because of our careers and what we see, which are effectively all of the wide variety of things that can go wrong, from car accidents to medical stuff to structure fires to hazmat to all kinds of bizarre stuff, is we become more attuned to the environment. Also, the big part of our job really is that we're problem solvers. So we're in the habit of looking for problems, and we develop this hypervigilance. This is also exacerbated by listening to the radio all the time, listening for other calls, and then particularly when you're not on duty, if you have pulse point, and now you're getting the stream of 911 calls. So your baseline mindset is to be looking for trouble, hearing about the things that are going wrong, hearing about these events that are actually relatively rare. So you take, for example, car accidents. Sure, we run dozens of them in the course of one of our shifts, but there's literally millions of driver miles going on out there. So we become more attuned to these negative events. That's the negativity bias. As emergency responders, we're hyper vigilant because we're always looking for problems to solve or hearing about problems. And that causes us to be skewed away from a more productive, positive state of mind into a negative one. And I'll have more on that in a couple of slides. The second part of this is these default modes. So when you're focused on something, possibly this lecture, if it's not too late in the afternoon, but as you're focused and you're listening, that's obviously the focused mode. And then when we're not in that focused mode, so maybe when we're driving to work or we're folding laundry or whatnot, so when we're not in that when we're not in that focused mode, we're in the default mode. This could be when you're driving your car to work. When we're not in the focused mode, we're in the default mode. This could be something you could do on autopilot, driving to work, for example, or folding laundry, something where you don't have to engage intellectually. Our brains are actually as active in that mode as they are when we're focused on something. And recall that they're problem solving machines. So they're always functioning, they're active, and their purpose for that continual function is to look for those problems. So if we don't give it thoughts to think about and engage with it will do what it does as a default, and it will find its own problems to solve. Or it'll just, and they don't have to be big problems. They're just maybe a list of things that you have to do, or you're considering something. So if you've ever tried to meditate or not think about something, and you'll get an opportunity in the next few months to try that, when we close our eyes and try not to think, we have this slideshow that can be amazingly fast and dense with data of ideas just pouring into our brain. All that is not your brain misfunctioning, that is your brain working. So that's a hint, that's the default mode going, that's your brain scanning the environment both externally and internally for problems. A key concept about how this affects where we are on that scale from flourishing to critically injured in the red, but positive or negative, is that when our minds are wandering, they tend to be less positive, they tend to be less happy versus when we're focused on something. So there's good research that indicates that how you feel or how you report you feel is largely determined by what you're thinking in the moment. So if you're people that are spaced out, they're not focused on anything in particular, report themselves as less happy in self-reports as people if they are focused on something and working on it when a reminder comes up to answer the question, how do you feel like that? People rate themselves as happier when they're in the focus mode. So clearly we can't be focused on something all of the time, but the useful part of this information is that we want to be exploring things in our lives that allow us to focus more often and just be mindful of the fact that when our mind is wandering, it's a less productive and a less happy mind. So it's not a magic bullet, but it's one more thing that contributes to positive states of mind, greater flourishing, and greater energy. When you are considering the continuum and where you are on it, a few things to keep in mind. So you want to think about how much capacity you have, how much connection you have in your life, and what's your state of mind. Consider those factors when you're positioning yourself on that continuum. So where am I? Really, if you feel like you have a lot of resources and you can label off social resources and you feel flexible of mind and mentally and your mood is stable and your health is good, then you have a lot of capacity. And along those lines, we want to be cognizant of where we are in the continuum because that indicates how much reserve that we'll have that we'll be able to bring to bear when things become challenging. So the less reactive we are, the healthier, the better slept, the better our diet is, the more connection we have, the better able we will be able to experience traumatic events or chronic stress without as much harm to ourselves. Along those lines with the connections, one of the great resilience skills is having good social connection and being able to not only offer help, but be able to ask for help and have those people involved. So where are we as far as how many resources we have in that? And then I think I just touched on it before, but this is another point, which is So as you look at the continuum and are analyzing where you're going to place yourself on that continuum, it doesn't have to be a big thing. You can just say, I feel this way or the other, but we're keeping in mind, how much capacity do I feel like I have to handle something that would be challenging and unexpected? How much connection do I have, both with myself, like understanding what's going on with me, what are my stressors and what are not, but also with other people that can serve as resources to you or to whom you can be a resource. And then what is your general state of mind? Is it positive, or is it neutral, or is it kind of a negative state of mind where you're seeing more things? So that's going to allow you to place yourself on the continuum. It's going to give you an idea of how much you have in reserve. The more resources, the better slept. The more of those boxes, so to speak, that you can check in a green column, the more reserve you're going to have. Importantly, form a plan of the resources that you're going to use if you end up, actually, I should say, when you end up in the orange, possibly even the red. What are the resources? Who are you going to ask for help and reach out to, and plan those ahead of time? And then we want to be very cognizant about recognizing and savoring the positive in our life because of two things. One, we all have that negativity bias, so it's our natural inclination to give greater emphasis to negative things and gloss over the neutral and positive. So the way in which we counteract that and impact our state of mind is to recognize the things that are even neutral in our life or positive in our life, and then take a moment to appreciate them. That's savoring in our life. I've spoken quite a bit about states of mind and positive versus negative states of mind. I want to be really clear when speaking about positive states of mind, we're not talking about being happy and upbeat. We're talking about having things that like calm our survival brain, so to speak. They reduce the amount of threat that we feel. They enable us to bring our prefrontal cortex, our thinking part of our brain, online. So it doesn't mean you have to be happy. You certainly can. These are 10 examples of positive emotions that we can experience. And as you can see, for example, serenity, that's not necessarily associated with being really upbeat and bubbly, but it is peaceful and calm and connection. The same would go for inspiration, which may be in a religious setting, if that's how you roll, or it may be in the backcountry, if that's your cup of tea. So just keep in mind, talking about positive doesn't mean happy. It means emotions that tend to calm our nervous system and give us more access to our creative brain and our thinking. The reason why it's so important to strive for positive states of mind is, once again, when that prefrontal cortex is online versus the amygdala, also the survival part of the brain, we're more creative. So we can make connections, we can solve problems better. You can see how this would be applicable on the fire ground, or as an administrator, or on a medical call. We make connections more easily, so we can see signs in a patient, or we can see smoke indicators differently, or the number of cars parked outside some residence or a building when we're running a call on it. So we make connections better. We communicate better. We're not only is it just speaking, but we're better able to interpret what people are telling us and nonverbal signals they're giving us when we're in a positive state of mind. And we're also have greater motivation in general when we're in a positive state of mind. So these are all performance reasons why we should pursue that versus just a kumbaya reason. So if you want to be a high performer, seek out ways to have a positive state of mind. Cool. We're going to move on to resilience next. We'll see you shortly. Be well.